1900 was a time before TV and social media, obviously. But while radio communication was invented in the early part of this decade, we wouldn't see the wide availability of radio both as a means of entertainment and as a means of communication for American civilians until the 1920s. This doesn't mean that communication or entertainment was limited to in-person or written. There was a comparatively primitive telecommunication device called the telephone. Telephone companies would offer subscription services with different rates for different types of lines. While private lines were an option, this option was typically not available in rural areas, being enjoyed only by those who lived in the city, typically of the middle or upper class at that, as a private line was more expensive. For the lower class or people in rural areas, there was the party line. Those who wished to have a telephone line would get together to get one for not only their own houses, but anyone who they wished to communicate with in their area. Typically, a dozen or so households would be connected in one loop, and they would all pitch in for the monthly subscription, thus offering a fast method of communication over long distances. There was a limit on how many people could be on the same line due to limits in technology. Some more affluent people would have 2 or more phones in their houses, one for each loop, and so a group of people they wanted to be in contact with. In times of emergency, these people would be vital in alerting the area as they could reach more people. In the very early days of phones did not have a dialing system in their hardware. Not even a primitive rotary phone was in popular use yet in the 1900s. In the 1900s, a crank telephone was much more common. A crank phone around this time period was typically powered by wet batteries, but later on dry batteries replaced those. To use a telephone to call someone within your party line, a person would turn the crank to signal the operator to pick up the handpiece and tell the operator who they wanted to call, and the operator would ring the bell in the rhythm according to whom they were calling, and begin the call once the correct person picked up the phone. Each person on the line would be assigned a letter. When one wished to call the other, the operator would ring the bell for that letter in Morse code. When the person on the party line heard their specific ring, they would pick up the phone. Everyone on the party line would hear the bell via their own phones. Anyone could pick up the receiver and listen if they wanted to. Thus, the phone became not only a center of easy communication, but of gossip as well. Some, even in the time of radio and TV, would go on to say that eavesdropping on the party line was the highest form of entertainment. If someone wanted to call someone outside the party line, they would turn the crank to signal the switchboard operator, pick up the receiver, and tell the operator who you wanted to call by giving them a specific number, usually 3 to 4 digits, including an R which indicated the ring pattern. The operator would connect you to the receiver or to another switchboard in another station, who would connect you either to the recipient or yet another switchboard, depending on how long this distance was. Keep in mind, the ringing system, along with phones themselves, were very dynamic and often varied in their operation depending on the provider, number of subscribers on the line, and what type of hardware was used in the system. This was back in the day before a handful of corporations controlled the phone industry and before phones and phone systems were so regulated and standardized. Back in the 1900s, a single locality could have multiple small businesses that offered the service. So what I've just described was not the only type of phone calling experience available even to rural consumers during this time period, far from. Of course, with this old school technology came old school shenanigans and etiquette. Given how the party line worked, only one call could be made on the line at a time. If Gertrude was on the phone with Ruth, but you wanted to make a call, you would either have to wait until they were done with their conversation or politely ask them to wrap it up. It was considered common courtesy to keep calls brief, infrequent, and not terribly late at night or early in the morning, lest the bell wake people up. Sometimes pranksters would intentionally leave the handpiece off so that the line would stay busy and no one could make a call. Other times, someone would ring the bell very late at night or early in the morning and keep ringing until confused half-awake people answered, then hang up. Still others would intentionally hold long, drug-out conversations, giggling at each exaggerated sigh or huff of someone wanting to make a call. Some rather crafty people would use code words such as the weather to talk about risque subjects or spread gossip. Sunny out, isn't it?
Clear skies today and tomorrow. It'll be rainy after that.
Oh, my flowers will love that. Local governments even had to make laws surrounding the nature of the early party line. Many areas had laws stating that if someone had an emergency, the calling parties would be legally obligated to end their call so that the person could call the local police, hospital, and or fire station which all could have their own numbers back then, as 911 wasn't established until 1968. Now, would someone like me have had a telephone? Chances are yes. As someone who is, or at least wants to be connected to the surrounding community, I would have wanted a means of quick communication with my neighbors, especially the parents of the children I regularly see at school and members of my church. While visits and letters are cheap and easy means of communication, they are not nearly as convenient. If I wanted to check in on how a sick child is doing, but didn't want to risk getting sick myself, I could simply call the child's mother. If I was too busy for a visit but wanted to check to see if Jones had any spare coal I could use in a pinch, I could simply ring him. If Mr. Kirsch's horses got loose yet again and was eating my radishes, I could kindly inform him that he needed to fix his fence while keeping an eye on the horse. But most importantly, if a major announcement needed to be made to the parents of the children of the school district, I could call the parents on my line who could spread the news faster than I could myself. The other side of the telecommunication coin is the telegraph, a direct precursor to the telephone. We've learned about the role of the telephone in rural American life, but how about long-distance communication if you didn't have a phone? Aside from snail mail, you could order a telegram via the electrical telegraph. The electrical telegraph was a point-to-point text messaging system popularly used from the mid-19th century until the late 20th century. It did see use up until the early 21st century, but very few people were sending telegrams by then. The device itself worked by interrupting electrical currents sent via wire to another telegraph office. These interruptions were in Morse code, with short interruptions being the dots and longer interruptions being the dashes. Once these impulses had traveled to their destination office, a register recorded the dots and dashes on a strip of paper. An operator would write out the message and have it delivered to the recipient. To send a telegram, you would simply have to visit your nearest telegraph office with your message, fill out a form indicating your message and the address of your recipient, and pay a small fee to have this message sent, interpreted, and delivered. This offered fast, near-private communication to someone who could be states away. Much like text messages today, many words were abbreviated and short language was often used in order to cram as much information in a telegram as possible because telegrams were billed by the word. Some people developed code words, and businesses had entire books filled with codes that used combinations of letters. Big telegraph businesses encouraged this by giving code users a discount, as it was less work for them. Much like the telephone, the telegraph varied in construction and operation. For example, there were teleprinters that used piano or harpsichord keys to send and receive messages, bypassing the Morse translation altogether. However, these were very difficult to manufacture, and you needed your receiver to have one too, so their usage was mainly restricted to bigger cities, mainly along the East Coast. There were also telegraphs developed and used mainly in other countries, such as the Cook and Wheatstone one-needle telegraph, which used a rotating needle and a 4-unit code to communicate letters and numbers. Needless to say, what I have just described was, again, not the only experience with telegraphy even a rural person could experience. Despite these relatively newer developments in communication technology, people would still depend largely on written and in-person communication, as it was the most accessible. You don't need to invest in a telephone line for you and your communicating party if you could just give them a visit, nor did you need to spend the modern equivalent of $10 or more, such as you would with a telegram, if you were okay with the time it would take for your letter to arrive. Typically, a neighborhood or group of people in general would only invest in a telephone line if they deemed it necessary, or at least worth the investment, and a telegraph would be saved for urgent messages. A letter would suffice for just catching up with people a long distance, and a home visit would serve just the same for people you see often. Still, by the 1900s, telegrams were fairly popular, the technology already being over 60 years old and getting cheaper and cheaper to use. The telegram would see its peak popularity in the 20s to 30s when it became cheaper than long-distance calls, even if you did have a phone. But after this peak, it would slowly face a decline as telephone technology and infrastructure became more and more widespread and cheaper to install, implement, and facilitate. Telegrams would generally fade away over the next several decades, with the Western Union's dwindling service being terminated on the 27th of January 2006, and the rest of the world not too far behind, as the last telegram in the world was sent in 2013.